Claudine Hemingway is a descendant of famed writer Ernest Hemingway. We bumped into each other at a party and decided to team up and dive deep into French history, but with a twist, by bringing a spotlight to those lesser known creatives in France. This is History with a Hemingway. So welcome back to Paris History, Avec, Hemingway. I'm back with Claudine, and today we are talking about the floods of the Seine River. I don't know if you guys are aware, but the Seine has flooded several times, and some were much more devastating than others. Claudine's going to talk about the biggest flood I think that we've seen, and we're going to learn all about it today.
Yeah, and now that I have spent like literally a few days doing this, I'm now terrified.
Oh no.
It is like this story could literally be made into like a horror movie. Like if you remember the movie that had like Pierce Brosnan and it was all about a mountain that was going to explode and exploded and
Yes.
erupted and lava was everywhere. That's exactly how I was picturing while I was researching and writing about this story.
Oh wow. Okay, guys. So
So
be ready to be scared.
yeah. So it's not going to, ones we have coming up soon will be maybe more scary, but the Seine itself, as everybody knows about this big flood in 1910, which is what we're really going to talk about it. But it goes back all the way. The flood has, the Seine has flooded, and we have notes of that going back to the 4th century. The first noted flood was in 358. And then the next big flood that they had, the earliest one that they've measured that was like devastating, was January of 583. And it was noted by historian Gregoire de Tours. He mentioned it in his 6th century book about the history of the Franks.
Wow.
So this goes back a long way. And just think about what the landscape of the city looked like that then. I mean, completely different, obviously, than what we have. So you back then it would have been way easier for that water to spread and spread fast, and then also take out everything in its path, because things back then were built out of like what, twigs.
Yeah.
So it was, but the Seine is much more than what we see going through Paris. A lot of people know it as the center of Paris. It's always romanticized. There's songs about it. It is beautiful. Nothing is better than walking down the Seine on a lovely warm evening when the sun is going down. Or early on a Sunday morning, the best. But the Seine is actually 485 miles, and it starts in Burgundy and goes all the way out to Le Havre, which empties into the English Channel. So it's really, I mean, it pretty much cuts through, almost all the way through from one side of France to the other. Just about. There's 4 dams on it that could help control the water, which is also part of the problem that we run into with some of this. And then there's 3 rivers that feed into it: the Aube, the Marne, and the Yonne. Those all 3 feed into that. And so when there's big events happen, this all just adds to the problem. In 1206, half of the city was underwater, and the shrine of Saint Geneviève, which we talked about, which was her feast day just earlier in the month of January. And we did 2 podcast episodes about her last year, and we love her. And she is known that even though she died in the 5th century and 6th century, her remains, her reliquary, has saved the city hundreds and if not thousands of times. And in 1206, the city was underwater again. And so they decided to bring her procession with her relics down from Saint-Étienne-de-Mont down to Notre Dame. They were in Notre Dame. They had mass. They go to the edge of the Petit Pont, which is where the Saint Marcel, basically his reliquary, also bids her adieu as she goes back up the hill. As soon as she crossed over that bridge, the Petit Pont, it completely collapsed into the water.
Whoa.
And that had happened 10 times. In 200 years, that bridge has collapsed 10 times. And the Petit Pont is the one that if you are on the Ile de la Cité and you have, if you're looking towards the left bank, you have Notre Dame on your left and the prefecture on your right. It's that teeny tiny one that kind of goes, it's on Rue Saint-Jacques. So it goes up Rue Saint-Jacques. So it's a Petit Pont means a tiny little bridge. It's literally a very small bridge, but it collapsed over 10 times in over 200 years.
That doesn't sound very safe.
No, but that back then, you had like in 1280, the flood destroyed the Pont aux Champs, which is on the other side, connecting the right bank to Ile de la Cité. You also had in 1296, almost all the bridges were either became impassable or destroyed. But back then, the bridges were made of wood. They
Mhm.
weren't, a lot of them weren't made like today when they're made of stone, a little bit better. Water and wood aren't exactly the best of friends over time. So, keep that in mind when we say they were, this isn't going to happen today. I mean, it would take like a giant barge running into it.
Yeah.
But adding to the protection of the city, when you walk down the Seine, you've got those huge walls on either side of you. If you're walking down below or you're walking above and you look down, there's these huge walls on the quay. Those walls weren't there at one point. The Louvre sat there, basically just it was sand, right? Like you were standing on the side of any other river in the world. So in 1312, the first walls are created on the Quai de Grand Augustin, which is over on the left bank, just kind of right there past Pont Neuf. Those are added in 1312. In 1369, some walls were added on the opposite side, and then in 1578, when they were building Pont Neuf, most of that area around it, they had to enforce that with walls because the Pont Neuf was the first bridge that was not going to have homes on it. And it was stone. So you had to reinforce all that. When I also mentioned that all these bridges were destroyed, all the bridges back then also had homes on it. So it was like when you go to Florence and the Ponte Vecchio, where they have all the buildings, that's what the bridges of Paris once looked like.
That must have been really cool to look at. Those are probably beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's probably a pretty good view. I mean, who knows? I mean, you think of how much it costs to live on Ile Saint Louis. How much would it cost to live on the bridge?
Yeah. Expensive.
But if they had insurance back there, but it was like crazy expensive.
Yeah.
Like you're not living on a floodplain, like you're living in the flood.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it was cheaper for that reason.
It's probably, yeah. So they met, they were adding up all these walls, which was great. In 1870, under Baron Haussmann, he replaced and added 15 bridges were replaced or added. And in the 1960s, the expressway on the riverbank was open. So today, when you go and you're walking on the right bank, where they do the Perry Plage, and you have those huge walkways, that was actually part of the streets that was actually an expressway, and then they closed those over time. And just last year there was like the moratorium on the amount of time that could be closed was reached, and there was a possibility they could open back that up to cars, but thankfully that got squashed, and they kept it so we could still walk on it, which is great. But all of that thing, just think about the difference of the before the 14th century, before they had those walls, of course, I'm sure. And we don't even know. I mean, we only have so much going, when you look back that far. I mean, I spent probably 2.5 days, and there was, what started me on this was the flood of 1658, because I was reading about this one bridge and found out how it was destroyed. And then I was like, what other floods are there? And I probably spent a day and a half looking for information about the 1658 flood, and it's almost impossible.
Oh, it's so hard to find it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm gonna have to go to like the History of Paris Museum and try to go there, and then even go like there's some of the different museums you could get into, like a contact, just so, because now I'll just add it to my list of 4,000 things I'm obsessed with.
Perfect.
Perfect. But the gauging of the level of the Seine began in 1649. So basically, after that biggest flood, they decided, hey, maybe we should create a system that we're kind of keeping an eye on when this gets higher. So in 1649, it started on the Pont de la Tournelle, which is very interesting because that's the bridge where the very tall statue of Saint Genevieve looks east of the city to protect it. So that is where they used to measure the levels of the flood. Now they do it just down a little ways at the Pont d'Austerlitz, which is where the official gauge is now. But most people usually think of a statue on the Seine down a little closer to the Eiffel Tower, that they think that is the official marker. And I know that you've seen that, because every time it floods or the water starts getting higher, it's all over social media and all over the news in Paris.
Yep.
So his name is there. It's on the Pont de Nama, and it crosses the Seine just over there. And it's kind of actually really close to, if you know where Princess Diana died and where there's the golden flame of the Statue of Liberty, that's the bridge. And so on the side there is a Crimean war soldier, and it's a Zouave, and it was a statue done by Georges Dibot. It was created in 1856, and it was actually modeled after a real soldier named Andre Louis Gaudy by Napoleon III. who he actually personally selected as to be the model for this. When the Seine rose in 1910, it was Zouave that stood basically submerged in the water, but it wasn't just him. At one point, there was four statues on each. There's four pillars going into the Seine. There was one on each pillar. Two on each side. And when the bridge was replaced in 1860, they were actually placed lower down into the water. So they were when I get to talk about the gauges and mention where it was on him as we go through each day of this flood. Now, today, he's about 2 feet higher. So if you use the same gauge, which almost everybody does of anything I've ever, armchair historians or reporters use, they'll say, oh, well, if it was that, then this is what it would be. Now, if I use those gauges and said it's up to his neck, we'd be screwed because he's about 2.5 feet taller than he was when they actually measured him in 1910. So it's a big difference. But in 1970, the bridge was restored and the three statues are removed. But you can find them. There's one in the Bois de Vincennes, there's one in La Fère, and then one in Dijon. So of course now it's like I need to go and find each one of these guys. But he is pretty cool. And I mean, when the waters get higher and you're down there all the time for photos, I'm sure that you pop over there and check them out. But you could always see people gathered around the bridge looking down. And it's a statue of a man. So it's easy to be like, oh, it's at his ankles. It's at this. But yeah, so nowadays we'd be really screwed if it got up to if it got up to his neck, we would you wouldn't be in Montmartre. You'd be good.
Yeah, I'm super safe on my hill.
You're up there. You help. But in 1658, this is the flood. It's the highest flood that has ever been noted in going through Paris. It was 8.96 meters, so it's almost 30 feet above normal. It is higher than it's ever been before. That year, they had 8 more floods. That same exact year in 1658. It washed away the Pont Marie. It washed away 2 other bridges. So it was actually pretty devastating. After that flood of 1658, they decided, Paris, instructed by Louis XIV, so he does good things, a canal was, they decided that they needed to do something to help alleviate some of this water. So there was an idea to dig a canal that would go from the Marne to the Seine, and then also to add another river along the way too that would help alleviate some of that water, but none of that ever happened. In 1663, there was over 10,000 meters of drains in the city and tunnels, and 200 years later, there was 80,000 meters. So that definitely helped a little bit. In 1910, that those would actually come to as part of the disaster. But in 1879, there was another one, and it wasn't a flood, but this was ice. And this actually sounds horrific because there was a very cold November and it started December. It was frigid, freezing cold in Paris. And on the night of the 10th, the temperature dropped to a frigid -11 degrees.
Wow.
Fahrenheit.
Whoa.
Not Celsius, Fahrenheit. It caused the Seine to basically freeze overnight. In an attempt to break up the ice, they decided to use dynamite, there's actually pictures. I'll post pictures on my website. There's pictures, and this looks like it's probably a good 8 or 10 inches thick, the ice is. So they're trying to blow it up. It's sending these giant chunks of shards. And at the same time, it was destroying everything in its path. And so there was this picture, you could actually see giant wine barrels floating down, stuck in the ice. There's furniture and wood, everything that was coming, because as they were blowing it up and then it was being moved down the Seine, these giant chunks of ice were destroying anything in its path. So if you had wooden bridges supports or boats or barges, and it was wood, it would just demolish them.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's just really crazy. So I found pictures of it I first found pictures and it said it was from 1786. And I was like, wait a minute, they didn't have cameras.
What is this?
And then I actually did a reverse search of the image and found out, no, it's 1876. Yeah. But it all takes us to 1910, and that was the big one. So the summer of 1909 was very wet in France. which led to a lot of snow in the mountains in November and December. But New Year's Eve day in 1910 was quite warm in Paris. It was 43 degrees and sunny, which was very strange. What is a little scary as I was doing this was 103 years later, this year, it was 59 degrees in
Wow.
Paris on New Year's Day. So that made me, I was like, well, at least good. At least it's cool. But now I'm going to be like, I'm like an amateur meteorologist. But while the warm temperatures and the blue skies were lovely in Paris, off the coast of Brittany, this huge low pressure system was coming in and bringing a lot of rain with it. The sun had already risen 3 times since the start of December because it had been so warm, and all of that snow and ice was melting into the rivers and coming down into the city. But that none of those had never gotten to the point where they had to be worried about it until that last week of January. The warmer temperatures, as I said, just warmed everything up. And so you had all of these mountains that were covered with snow and ice, and just everything was rapidly melting. Right now, this year, there's not a lot of snow in the mountains, which then I was like, but there hasn't been a lot. There was some early when we had that huge cold spell in Paris, but now there's really not a lot. So as of right now, it doesn't look like what is going on is going to do anything to the Seine. But now I will let you know. I'm going to create a weather app.
Yes, please create a weather app.
Weather app. But they were just, people in Paris are just going about their early January days. But the smaller villages that are up and down the river started to see some pretty frightening sights. It all started to begin about January 20th. On January 20th, 50 miles southeast of Paris, the coal town of Lorry was in dire straits. It was a coal town. They had all of these tunnels that they had been digging. The rain had been nonstop there for 2 days, and but it wasn't the flood of the Seine that they were worried about. It was what was going to come from up above the hill. So they get done with work, and it's a coal village. Everybody works. All these people work so hard. These guys probably came home from dinner, to sit down for dinner with their family. They were sitting there, and all of a sudden they heard this huge, loud eruption noise, and everything began to shake. And at that point, the whole nearby hill and the ground gave way, sending tons of mud and debris crushing into these homes and people.
Yikes. Oh my God, that's terrifying.
Yeah, see, I told you it's gonna be scary. So, but back further away in Troyes, where Saint-Geneviève had gone to get grain to save the people of Paris, the rivers there were starting to overflow with water, and because they're sitting on the edge of 2 rivers, not only the Seine, but it started to just destroy all the homes and buildings in the path. As the news spread to Paris and the water rose, most people stood on the bridges and looked down, thinking this would just never happen here. But just a few hours later, they would not have those same cavalier thoughts. But back at this time, think again, this is over 100 years ago, 112 years ago. Well, 13 years now. Back in Paris, there was one man that had a job. His name was Edmond Maillet. He was to calculate the water and watch the water levels. And over 20 years, he had never seen it get higher than 5 meters on the Pont d'Austerlitz. But as early as January 16th, the water was getting so high but he didn't alert anybody. He didn't tell anyone. The next day, he didn't report to work for 2 weeks.
Oh,
the
no.
same 2 weeks that everything was raging, and he came back to work, but to this day, nobody knew why he was gone.
Wait, what? Where the heck was he?
Yeah, I don't know. But see, that's somebody, if this wasn't a natural disaster, somebody would have a conspiracy theory at this point.
For sure.
Yeah. In the movie, it could be, Edmund goes and releases all the dams, and the dams coming down and destroy.
Hey, let them pitch this to Netflix.
Yeah, exactly. I know I will. On January 21st, at exactly 10:53 p.m., the clocks around the city stopped. Paris had many functions that actually ran on compressed air, including the movements of the mail by the postal service, elevators, ventilation, and factories. All of it came to a screeching halt at 10:53 on the dot. So all of these clocks in the city stopped, because water got in there, and then everything, and it froze everything. So it all stopped. The water at this point was up to Zouave's ankles, and now it was picking up speed. And it was over 15 miles an hour. It was the fastest the Seine had ever been in centuries, and nothing in its path was safe.
Yikes.
So it just was like whatever it was picking up along the way was just flying down the river. From Troyes to and farther, the homes and the families that had, these homes and furniture, the furniture was just basically floating down and breaking up and crashing into things that came down the Seine. As it happens, since the 9th century, the bridges were struck and loud explosions could be heard. So these things would be flowing down, and it's like, it could be a bed just floating down and hitting a bridge and just exploding. But still, people of Paris thought, oh, this isn't that big of a deal. But the next day, on January 22nd, they woke up to find water in their basements, but they looked out the window and there wasn't very much water in the streets, so they couldn't figure out what was going on. More than 10 feet flooded into the city, but how it happened, and this is where it gets kind of scary, is it actually came from underground. So instead of what you would think a flood being the water gets really high, it overflows the bank, it just, goes everywhere. This was because it had rained so much that the ground was saturated. Plus, as I mentioned before, Paris had added all of these sewers, and also now they have all these tunnels and metro lines. So the water actually filled from below and just permeated through the city, coming from below the ground.
That sounds terrifying and unexpected.
Isn't it? Yeah. So now they didn't see us coming, and now Zawab, it was up to his knees. So it rose 10 feet overnight.
Wow.
So, but it still wasn't over the banks.
Oof.
Yeah. And then to make matters worse, it started snowing. So, but luckily the snow turned into rain, but then it just, at least with snow, it's like coming down what you feel like it is coming down slower. In the Bercy area, which is just kind of on the edge of the city, it was affected first. The streets, because it sits down a little lower too, the streets were completely flooded. They had wide waterways. And the Bercy, that is where all the wine merchants were. So at the time, they had all of their trying to save these huge barrels of wine that start floating away into the Seine. And then as those barrels came into the city, closer into the city, people were like risking life and limb to just hang over the bridge trying to grab one of these barrels. I mean, those barrels are like insanely heavy. I don't know what they were thinking they were going to do.
Yeah, this is
a
movie scene. This is insane.
Yeah, I mean, if it's apocalyptic, I'd probably do that too. But the Bercy, if you've been there, it's definitely a part of Paris that not a lot of people go, at least when you're visiting your first couple of times. But there's an amazing kind of like the Fairground Circus Museum, and I went there back in the spring, I think it was, or the fall, and there was this huge rainstorm that came in, and when I was leaving and I took a Uber because I was in a hurry to get someplace, they're just right out beside it on the main thoroughfare. You couldn't even drive through it just because from the rain there was so much water that it was down to from 3 lanes to 1, and it hadn't even been raining for that long. So I can't even imagine what it was like in 1910.
A nightmare.
Just a nightmare. But the power plants were also located out there. So they started short circuiting, and the metro lines at that point were filling with water, and some of them were coming to complete halt. Like it just, everything about it is like the perfect nightmare.
It is like
along the Seine
movie. It's just like the
volcano. It is, isn't
movie.
it? See, that's what I think you need. We need Pierce Brosnan here to go and come in, and maybe he wowould be Edmund, and he left for 2 weeks because he was trying to summon the relics of Saint Genevieve. It could be actually a superhero movie, and Saint Genevieve could be like the new DC superhero.
Yes, bring in the Marvel. I mean, that's all we get to watch anymore anyway.
I know. We need to cut this short. I got to call Disney. But it was just like everything about it was just a perfect disaster. And there's so much more than that, but we'll have to save that for next time. So hopefully we won't leave you in a complete state of flux and have nightmares for the next week to come back to hear. But as you know, it does have a good ending because, as you know, Paris is still there. Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. We can still stroll along the Seine, enjoy the bridges. So it did not completely go down, but tune in next week to find out what happens, and make sure you head over to ClaudineHemingway.com to learn more and contact her for travel planning.
Thanks for listening today, guys. If you're interested in learning more about Claudine, her tours, history, and the beautiful photographs that she posts all over Instagram, tune into her website, ClaudineHemingway.com.